This is the Sony A7RV, and here are the reasons I think this is the best camera ever created for wedding photography. Now, here's the disclosures. I do things with Sony sometimes. They have no idea I'm making this video, but this is one of the things that I spent my own money on and specifically upgraded from other cameras to this one in particular. And so in this video, we're gonna go over all the reasons why I decided to pick this camera up and make it kind of like my main camera for wedding photography. So if I had an A7 IV with me, it would be on this table. But I actually sold the A7 IV because I had just leaned into how much I appreciated this camera, and I used the money from the A7 IV to buy the A7CR. And if you've watched that video, you'll obviously know all the reasons that I love that camera. And a lot of those reasons obviously transfer over to this one, but this obviously as a professional tool just has everything that I would ever want in a camera as far as all the whole bells and whistles. So first off, kind of the main feature and the reason this says R in the name instead of S or nothing for that matter, it's that high resolution sensor. So this thing, 60 plus megapixels. 60 megapixels is a ton of megapixels. I used to be the person that hated any time like a new camera came out and it was like, oh, new megapixels. I wanted better low light performance and better high dynamic range. Turns out that this sensor, although even an old sensor, it's the same sensor that's in the A7R IV, a camera that I didn't really like that much because it has older menu systems and things like that. But whatever they're doing in processing as well as just the sensor itself is obviously a great sensor. And being that 60 megapixels, you get a lot of reach, you get a lot of versatility. You also get a ton of dynamic range. It's one of the things that really made me go with this system. There were times where I'd be shooting with my Leica M10s and I just wouldn't have the same amount of dynamic range. It felt like at least 1.5 stops to 2 stops better dynamic range performance on these cameras versus the Leica M10s, which for me as someone that shoots out in the outdoors quite a bit, that's kind of like my thing. It really needed to be something that was that kind of high dynamic range sensor that's going to bring as much detail as possible. The second bit out of that is the fact that 60 megapixels just gives you a lot of flexibility, specifically in the fact that you can use the APS-C crop mode to get 1.5 times reach. It's basically like having a built-in teleconverter. And when you go into the APS-C crop mode, you are still getting a 26 megapixel image. And I've talked about this on the channel before, but I think that that kind of like mid to upper 20s range is where you just kind of should be at as a professional in weddings and events and things like that. And I think that the APS-C crop as something that I used to feel, I guess when you had a lower megapixel sensor, it was just like a crop. It didn't feel like something that made sense in a way. But after using Fujifilm cameras in that same 26 megapixel pixel pitch, I guess, in a APS-C crop mode, it just made a lot of sense. I got used to that kind of resolution in there, and it made me feel completely fine about using the crop mode in APS-C mode on this camera. Now, the low light performance is something that definitely kind of takes a hit if you are delivering the files at 60 megapixels, but if you are using the files at 60 megapixels and then downscaling them, obviously the size of the noise and things like that is going to be reduced as well. So it's one of the things that I've learned recently, that if you are shooting with a high megapixel sensor and you just downscale that stuff back down, the image cleans up pretty well. And so as long as you have the ability to shoot at, high megapixels, but then rescale that down to a lower megapixel count, that noise seems to disappear a lot more, and I haven't found it to be much of an issue at all with these cameras. And then just the autofocus in these things is ridiculous. I will say that the new autofocus, the AI stuff in here that the A7 IV doesn't have, I could still use the A7 IV. I still use the A7 IV alongside this camera for most of, actually all of my wedding season. But the reason that this is just a little bit better is not that it's faster, it's just a little bit smarter. It feels like it just knows a little bit more of what I'm personally looking for and I want to be focusing on. Usually the way I have this set up anyway is to have the tracking box in the middle, and then whatever I put that on, whatever object, if it's an object, it'll track that thing. And if it is a person, it will just snag onto their eye a little bit better. And the focus on is just by far the best that I have ever used. It's incredible. And so for the times where I don't want to be using one of my fun manual focus cameras, this thing just nails focus every single time in every lighting scenario. It's just kind of incredible. Now, back to the reasons that this thing in particular is really, really great. The first of which is this tilt screen. Obviously, this was kind of one of the big things when this camera first came out, but I really think that any photo first camera shouldn't have a flip screen like this. This, to me, is a content creation vlogger thing. It is the, I need to see myself, and yes, incredibly useful. I just got done editing a video where I used this camera as my primary video camera as well, and it was fantastic. Like, having that is very, very useful. But as a pure photographic tool, I think that any camera that is a photo first camera should either have this particular screen where it does both, or simply have a screen like this that can pop out and you're like mostly aligned with the lens here. It's just something that is, I guess, like not that big a deal, but in practice, when I was pulling up this camera and then pulling up the A7 IV, I would just be like slightly annoyed every time that I pulled out the camera and had to use this and flip it around and do that. Like, it just was slightly annoying. With this, anytime I wanted to get a low angle, you just pull it out, use it kind of like a waist level viewfinder. It just worked seamlessly, perfectly. And it's one of the things that was a big convenience on this camera over something like the A7 IV. Now, speaking of screens, this screen isn't incredible, but it does the job really well. The viewfinder, however, is very, very good. It is like a 9 million dot viewfinder, which is absurd. Now, the only thing, and I don't see people talking about this, which kind of annoys me, but if you are using continuous tracking in photo mode, so like I'm holding down the AF on button, I have my camera set up to back button focus, and anytime that I'm holding this down, the resolution drops significantly. It drops very, very much down to something that, like, if I was trying to focus pull at that resolution, I would have no idea if it's in focus or not. It is honestly a really, really bad user experience, and I'm not sure if the camera is just using so much processing power to focus somehow that it like needs to downscale and downsample the resolution, but it's something that is super frustrating. And this viewfinder and the image that comes out of it, if you're tracking in video mode or if you're tracking some other way, it works great. But you're just losing the whole significance of how good this viewfinder is whenever I'm tracking, which is kind of most of the time in this camera. So while the viewfinder is incredible, this obviously happens on the A7 IV as well, but it's just a bummer that I feel like this viewfinder is sort of squandered on me the way that I use this camera, because back button focusing on that is just not that great. But if I'm using manual focus lenses, anything like that where I'm not using the tracking and continuously holding down the autofocus, it's fantastic. And again, a beautiful viewfinder. It's just one of those things that I really wish they could fix somehow. And I'm still pretty perplexed at why it has to be like that. The same thing goes for the A7 IV, but I do put these base plates on here. These are just like basic ones from Small Rig, but they work really well. They also have the tripod plate on here in case I want to do like a long exposure or something like that. I do those pretty often at the end of wedding days. The feel of this and the balance of it all just works really, really well. And for the photographic tool that it is, just works fantastic. So I know I made another video on this in particular, but after kind of making the decision specifically and using them both side by side all year, here's kind of my recommendation on who would benefit most from this camera versus something like the A7 IV. Now, I will also say the A7 IV, if you're someone that is not bothered by some of these other features or whatever, like that camera is incredible. It's a great camera and it is basically just like the perfect camera otherwise. This thing just has that next level of features and that next level of conveniences that make it, for me at least, worthwhile. So if you're someone that is looking to get an A7 IV or you want to save a little bit of money, do not feel like you have to buy this camera. These are just the reasons that I decided to go with this system in particular. But if you're someone that wants to use the APS-C crop mode at all, I know my friend Magic made a whole video about how he shoots at the medium DNG and then uses the crop mode interchangeably so that he has the same resolution across the board no matter what. If you're someone that wants to do that, that is a great use case for this camera. If you're someone that is as annoyed as me about the flip screen on some of the other cameras and just loves this thing, this camera is obviously really worthwhile. And the viewfinder here is definitely a big upgrade. I will say that in use, when I'm pulling them each up to my face, like I can definitely tell the difference. It's noticeable. It's a better experience overall. As a wedding photographer, you're pulling it up to your face so often and you're shooting thousands and thousands of photos. You're there for 8 to 12 hours a day with something like this. So all of those little times, it kind of does make a big difference. But is the A7 IV one unusable? Obviously not. It's great. It's just smaller, less resolution, all that kind of stuff. And so it's just a minor convenience, but something that over time, depending on how much you're using it, could be worthwhile. And then the autofocus is just another one of those like conveniences. Basically, this whole camera comes down to, it is just like a more convenient version of the A7 IV. The A7 IV is fantastic, but if you just want all those extra conveniences, that's where this thing is. The autofocus is just slightly better. If you can't get good autofocus out of the A7 IV, then that's a you problem, not a camera problem, because the camera itself is fantastic. And this is just another one of those, just a little bit smarter, a little bit better. It's marginal gains for sure, but it is a convenience that is, I'm just fighting a little bit less with the camera. The camera is just doing things a little bit better for me. And it's ultimately a reason why I think the system is a little bit more worth it, right? So ultimately, whatever camera you go with between the A7 IV and the A7R5, again, you're going to be in very, very good hands. But hopefully this kind of made sense as to my rationale, my reasoning behind going with this camera over the A7 IV. Specifically as a photographer, there are definitely more reasons to, I guess, hash out the other things within the video space. But specifically as a photographic tool, something that I'm relying on to make images and make money for myself and make beautiful things for my clients. That's why this thing is just ultimately the best photographic tool that I've probably ever used. And the reasons why I decided to stick with this platform over the A7 IV. Now, if you want to see my original comparison between the two of those cameras, you can check that out up here. Check out my first impressions and like little review on this camera up here, and I'll see you in one of those videos.